I worked for a sheriff's department in East Texas for the first 2 years I was a cop. I currently work at another department in the same area. I'm gonna have to change names so I don't get in any legal trouble or upset surviving family. Also, I don't want to rustle any feathers with colleagues. The law enforcement community is very tight-knit and egos bruise like bananas. Some of you will probably deduce what county I'm talking about from the few clues I give you anyway. But I gotta change up the story enough for plausible deniability. You know the drill. Standard creepypasta stuff. My county was as big as Dallas or Austin County, but only had a population of 14,000 people in it. In a lot of places, you can only travel on foot. It's as bayou as you can get and still be in Texas. Creeks and rivers run through it like veins, making the area prone to flash floods. The most common sight is a tightly packed forest pushed up against blacktop roads. The most common way to die is falling asleep at the wheel or being ambushed by a deer that wants to take its own life. Since there aren't a lot of people and these people are poor, it means deputies are paid crap. Not that I was only in it for the pay. I loved being a cop. I pledged to be one of the good ones that stuck to his ideals and didn't become a cynical asshole. Well, I stuck to my ideals, but became more of an asshole with each passing day. What's worse than the pay is the safety concerns. There are only 2 deputies out on a given night, one for the south end and one for the north. This means your only backup is usually 20 to 40 minutes away from you, and if your partner is handling an emergency, then you're out of luck. This made the area seem like one of the last remaining bits of the Wild West. You had to keep your wits sharp and watch your 6 when all alone in the woods. As romantic as the idea was of being Walker, Texas Ranger, it almost got me killed. It was the perfect storm of circumstances. My county had suffered severe flooding the week before this happened. The water was going down in most parts, but some places were still flooded. Another great thing was our radios had been down all day, someone coming to fix it in the morning, and the rain began pouring again. The call came in around midnight about a man beating on a woman's door. The man was demanding to be let in out of the rain. The woman said she was alone with her baby and needed a cop fast. I was in the dispatch located in the jail side of the sheriff's department when the call came in, and my dispatcher, who was like a mother hen, gave me a look that said, "I've got a live one." Her eyebrows raised as she snapped at me to get my attention. Her phone was tucked to her ear while her other hand typed furiously. I listened to her repeat information out loud for me as I scribbled down the caller's address in my notepad. It was in the flash flood zone. It was passable, but the continuing storm was changing this quickly. Another hour of hard rain would cut it off from the rest of the world. My dispatcher swiveled in her chair to look right at me, her face serious. "Call me on your phone when you get close. Radios are still down, so I'll call you every 10 minutes for a security check." "Got it, Sherry," I said, as I spun around to hurry to my patrol car. "I let the South End deputy know what you got in case he needs to get to you," she quipped, as the heavy door to the jail slammed behind me. I appreciated the gesture from her, but having backup almost an hour away didn't mean much if things popped off. Backup could be coming from the moon for all the difference it made. I squeezed myself into the crowded front seat of my patrol vehicle. I hadn't even entered the address into my onboard GPS when my phone started ringing. It was Sherry at dispatch. "What you got?" I asked. There was an unusual pause before she spoke. I could hear the concern in her voice. "Hey, just learned this. Our caller said it may be Ezekiel Burrows out there." I paused before turning the key in the ignition. This wasn't good. I had dealt with Zeke before. It was back when I was a rookie. I'll have to put this story on hold to fill you in with a flashback episode first. I had been working for 2 weeks at the time. I was still riding shotgun with my FTO. A unanimous caller rang the sheriff's department complaining Zeke and his older brother were driving around pointing guns at people and firing into the air. My field training officer had been a stereotype of an old county cop who was about to retire. He was laid back and calmly gave instructions between drags of a cigarette. He wore a bushy white walrus mustache and cowboy hat that fitted him perfectly. When the call came across the car radio, his demeanor flipped like a switch. He sat forward and flicked his cigarette out the window. His face darkened. "All right, deputy. This could get dangerous. Stay alert, stay close, and do everything I tell you." We were burning towards the call pretty fast when he offered this additional piece of information. "I know these two brothers. They've been known to fight with the police. Don't be afraid to go hands-on if you need to," he said in his slow Texas drawl. My body dumped a ton of adrenaline for a fight-or-flight response, and I felt my stomach turn. I was glad my FTO was so calm for me. In those days, I used to be ashamed of the butterflies in my stomach. I thought it meant I was weak or a coward. Now, I realize it's my body's way of protecting itself, and I need to embrace the feeling. We found the brothers slowly rolling around in a hunter green Dodge Neon. It was missing a driver's side mirror and had a giant hole where a red brake light should be. It was great when they made our job easy. We initiated a felony takedown. That's pretty much when you point your weapon at the suspect vehicle while standing behind your car door. You give loud verbal commands like, "Driver, step out of the vehicle slowly." Anyway, we had both of them pulled out and detained in handcuffs. Nothing of note happened except for there being 2 shotguns and 3 rifles in the back seat. Ammo and shell casings were everywhere. Not illegal in the state of Texas, just highly suspicious. The original caller wanted to remain anonymous, so we had nothing to prove they were firing from the vehicle. My FTO dealt with Zeke's older brother while I talked with Zeke. I can't remember the brother's name, we'll just call him Turd for now. My FTO had our dispatch run both of their names to see if they had any active warrants. So we had some tense and awkward moments with the brothers while they waited to see if they were going to jail or not. Turd ran at the mouth for the duration of the stop, and called us every racist and vulgar thing in his extensive vocabulary of no-no words. I, being a rookie, got a little flustered at some things he had allegedly done to my mother, so I turned my attention to Zeke. Zeke stood there downcast and drenched in sweat. It was only 80 degrees, but he looked like he was about to suffer a heat stroke. His whole body began to tremble slightly and sway back and forth. You okay, Zeke?" I asked as I stepped closer to him. I thought I might have to catch him if he passed out on me. You see, Zeke smelled like hot garbage. It was pretty overpowering. A mixture of sweat and ass. I didn't want to touch him, but he was cuffed behind his back. I couldn't let him tip over with nothing but his head to break his fall. We would be liable, of course. Lucky for me, Zeke straightened up when I reached for him. His eyes bulged as he looked right at me, his teeth bared in a grimace. "Is this one gonna kill me, Jesus?" he whispered in a raspy voice. His vacant eyes locked with mine. "No, Zeke, you're just being detained while we check if it's good to let you and your brother go," I said, while trying to hide how creeped out I was. Zeke paused and tilted his head to the side slightly. A smirk touched the edge of his mouth and he nodded as he agreed with something. The next thing he said was really strange. It's been a while since that day, so my memory is foggy, but I remember it being something like, "I'm supposed to tell you to remember my face during the massacre." "What?" I said, as I turned to face him squarely. His brother must have heard the change in my tone of voice. He leaned over to yell past my FTO. "Hey, yo, keep your mouth shut, Zeke. Let me handle these pigs." Zeke considered his brother calmly and replied, "You would be alone when you die, brother." Turd's eyes widened and I saw pure fear flash across his face. He scoffed and tried to play it off by laughing, but I could see through his bravado. His brother scared him. Long story short, both brothers came back clear of warrants. The original 911 caller wanted to remain anonymous. This meant we had no witness to any alleged illegal activity. With nothing to hold them for, we let them loose. But I do remember one more creepy thing Zeke said. When they were uncuffed, the two walked back to their car. Turd went for the driver's seat and Zeke went to sit in the seat behind him. "I'm your chauffeur now, huh, bitch?" Turd asked angrily. Zeke was staring at something in the passenger seat while shaking his head slowly. "No," Zeke replied coolly. "He is already sitting there. I'm not going to make him mad. He's been staring at you all day." Zeke's brother had said something muffled to Zeke and got into the driver's seat. As they drove away, I could see Zeke sitting in the back, half-turned, and pointing at something beside his brother in the passenger seat. Before they had pulled out of earshot, I could hear Turd begin screaming profanities at his brother. So, that's the previous on the TV show of my life. That was my first run-in with Zeke, and now, it seemed I was racing to him again years later. Zeke's little origin story always sat differently with me. I never encountered him in person after that initial contact, but word of his exploits would always reach me. An elderly woman had her door kicked in by the two brothers. She was beaten and robbed, didn't call the cops until a week later because her grandson made her. She was too terrified to give a witness statement, but the grandson told me the entire street knew it was Zeke and Turd. An outdoor birthday party was canceled when Zeke popped out of the woods and started firing a shotgun in the air. I spent the rest of the night trying to reel in the trigger-happy relative looking for Zeke in the woods. A caller we 90% knew was Zeke kept calling dispatch and threatening to kill the sheriff on recorded lines. He was mad that his brother was arrested. The problem was, Turd was arrested by a neighboring county, not us. It was evident Zeke was sliding further and further to the dark side. He was the Riddler to my Batman. I could never catch up with him. He just left problems for me to deal with. But now, maybe I had him. I could physically put cuffs on him. My GPS said I was 10 minutes out from the caller's house. It was going to be a little longer because of the downpour. Visibility was low, and I could feel my ride trying to hydroplane a few times. When I was about 2 minutes out, the road before me just seemed to disappear. The white lines just vanished as water flooded the road. Turning on my takedown lights didn't reveal where the high water ended, so I stepped out of my car to take a better look. In the darkness, all I could hear was the sporadic thumping of droplets hitting my raincoat, and the mechanical back and forth of my wipers in overdrive. Before me was a flat plain of water rippling from millions of raindrops. Every few seconds, the area would illuminate with lightning, showing me the deep water continued around the bend in the road. My mind went back to the PS1 days of Silent Hill. The first thing I did as a terrified 5th grader was try to leave the town, only to find an endless drop-off in the dense fog. I had a similar feeling of dread now, but this time, it was an impromptu lake and not a cliff, and I was running towards the danger, not away from it. I was weighing my options and considering letting dispatch know it was impossible. I was in a Charger, not a Tahoe. Maybe Zeke found somewhere else to stay dry. I mean, he hasn't broken any laws yet. My phone began to ring. It was dispatch. Before I could even say hello, I was met with, "You there yet, deputy?" "I'm around the corner. There's—" "He's back!" my dispatcher half shouted. "She's saying he's kicking the door and beating on windows. I can hear him threatening to hurt her in the background." At this moment, only one course of action was clear. I guess I'd be swimming if I had to. I slowly but steadily submerged my vehicle into the dark waters. I was praying it wouldn't drown out as the waters rose about 2 feet high around me. Water began seeping in from the bottoms of the doors as I made my way around the bend in the road. I could see the land before me as I began to get more traction and pull up out of the water. I gassed my vehicle to give it one last lurch to exit the water and spin out into the muddy road. I hit the brakes to get a quick layout of my surroundings. The red stop sign of a 4-way intersection reflects in me. I was now in a small residential community. My GPS told me the caller's house was across the intersection and 3 houses down on the left. It was hard to see it through the downpour, but I could see the road disappeared under the water again. I got out and began to walk. I wasn't going to risk getting my car stuck and trapped in the driveway. As I sloshed forward, tension began to build in the back of my neck. Silent lightning would periodically illuminate me in a sea of ripples. A cold feeling surrounded my thoughts. A black hole opened in my stomach, sucking all the confidence out of me. This was new. I had been scared before, but fight or flight was always set in with a burst of nervous energy. But this was surreal. I felt like I was dreaming. I felt dread. I felt alone. I was in water up to my knees when I reached the yard. I finally got some higher ground the closer I came to the front door. I squished around to my left and right, checking the sides of the house. The house was a double-sized trailer elevated 3 feet off the ground on stilts. I had to walk up the steep stairs to knock on the door. "Sheriff's Department," I yelled over the rain. I jumped back down with a splash off the narrow steps and scanned the darkness. I heard a rumbling at the door as it opened a couple of inches. I could see a feminine face peeking out at me. "Can I see a badge or something?" came her fearful voice. I cocked my head at this. Before I remembered, I was completely covered in my yellow Wyatt Earp raincoat. I unbuttoned my trench coat and shone my flashlight on my badge and duty belt. "He was here just now," she said nervously. Her eyes darted back and forth, scanning the dark. I could hear the frantic cries of a child from deeper in the home. "Lock the door, but stay by it for me. I'll check around back, so don't worry if you hear me make a noise back there." I waited till I heard her lock the door before pulling out my gun and circling around to the left. I circled the whole house slowly, making the corners with deliberate slowness. My small but powerful flashlight was held at the center of my chest with my gun at low ready. The entire perimeter of the house checked clear. My head was on a swivel, checking the thick forest pushing in from the darkness. I even checked her small car, pulled on the doors to see if they were left unlocked. There was nothing suspicious. He was gone. But I felt eyes on me. The cold dread sat heavy in my stomach, making me slightly nauseous. I could feel a nervous tingle at the base of my skull, making me want to turn my head frequently. Then the obvious realization hit me with an extra punch to the gut. He was under the house. It was 3 feet off the ground. My dumbass had been walking around him. I was standing with my back a foot away from the home. I immediately dropped to one knee with a splash and twist to aim my weapon and light under the house, my mind half expecting the jump scare from Zeke. Akin to the scene where they show the first xenomorph in the vents on Alien. My finger slowly loosened off the trigger as I saw nothing but interlocking planks of wood, cobwebs, and more darkness. I couldn't see fully under the house because it had been used to store old junk like a lawnmower, sandbags, and old bicycles. I stared intently for a while, trying to make out a human form. Every time I moved the blinding beam of light, it caused dark shadows to dance underneath, mimicking movement. I wasn't satisfied that he wasn't under there, but I couldn't see a damn thing. I backed away from the home and began to think. He was near, and he was probably watching me. I comforted myself with the realization that he was scared of me. and I had a captive audience. He was either under the house or waiting in the forest trying to not make a sound by running. "Zeke," I projected my voice with as much authority as I could. "This is the sheriff's department. We know it's you out here." I did a 360 scan around me with a flashlight as I slowly continued. "You haven't broken any laws yet. Go home now and that's the end of it. If I have to come back, you're going to jail, I promise it." As I finished my speech, I let the silence hang in the air for dramatic effect. Thunder rolled in the distance to punctuate my seriousness. Feeling confident in my ultimatum, I sloshed my way back to my patrol car. But don't get me twisted, dear listener. I'm not inept or cowardly. I had a plan and was leaving a ruse. When I got to my car, I called dispatch to tell her the plan. I told her to let our caller know I was going to drive back to the stop sign down the road and wait out for Zeke to return. Soon, I was back in my car with all the lights out, staring down the dark road towards the house. As I sat in the darkness listening to the chaotic storm envelop me, I checked my phone. Only 10 minutes had passed when I swear it had been an eternity. The strange, dreamlike feeling flooded over me again. I had a quick thought telling me I had never gone to the house in the first place. I had been just sitting here imagining the whole series of events that had just passed. Unsure, I patted my ankles to see if they were still wet. They weren't. I had never trudged in the water to check on the scared mother, but I remember doing it. I don't know, things are just so foggy. I had the sudden urge to cry. I didn't know why, I just felt so scared, so alone. Nothing made sense. I fought back a sob. A harsh voice spoke to me, cutting through my confusion like a poisoned knife through my brain. It said I should just end it. I should just use the tool holstered on my hip. I put my head against the coolness of my window. Hot tears ran down my face as my hand fumbled with the retention locks on my holster. The coolness of the window was my only relief before the end. Good thing it was snowing. The snow always made me sad as it formed a white coat of ice on my windows. Wait, snow? In Texas? I jolted with a gasp in my seat as if waking from a dream. Maybe I was. A micro dream? I'd had a couple of those in Marine boot camp due to sleep deprivation. But why had it happened now? I shook my head vigorously to get my bearings back. The dark thoughts fled from me. I realized the power on the street must have gone out while I was in my reverie because no light was coming from any of the houses. Visibility was zero and the storm was a deafening cacophony by now. Alone with my thoughts in the darkness, I doubted my plan. I had had enough of my mind playing tricks on me and wondered how long I should sit here like a creeper until I got back to regular patrol. My phone lit up, and I jumped to answer it before it could even ring. I immediately recognized my dispatcher's voice, but it sounded too far away. "He's back, right now, Her voice cut out and the call dropped. Noise chimed in my ear. Yeah, sometimes the cell towers were spotty out here, especially during storms. Now I had a useless phone I couldn't call backup with. My only hope was my dispatcher would give my partner a roll in my way. He was around 30 minutes to an hour away, remember? As I slammed my door behind me and began slogging through the rain, I thought to myself, on nights like this, I knew the future. I could just imagine the darkest timeline of events and it would happen. The thought of my cell phone crapping out had been a whisper in my mind since the night began. I didn't bring it to the forefront of my thoughts in the hope it wouldn't manifest, but it came true along with all the other bad vibes of the night. I prayed no more latent fears came to fruition, especially the deepest fear we all suppress every time we wear a badge. I was splashing through the mini ocean leading up to the front porch when I heard the screaming of the child. Not the normal screaming of a fussy infant, but a sharp, raspy scream, as if the child's throat was hurting from the exertion. Out came my gun again as I quickly ran towards the steep stairs. I did a quick duck to scan under the house with my light before I positioned myself beside the narrow stairs. I didn't go up them due to hearing about cops being shot off porches through closed doors as soon as they announced themselves. I banged on the lower part of the door with a fist and announced. I waited a beat for an answer or a gunshot. None came, and I weighed my options. I didn't have consent or a search warrant, but what I did have was good old exigent circumstances. And you see, exigent circumstances are what firefighters use to kick your door in when they smell smoke. As long as they believe danger is on the other side of the door, I can ram it in. And if police believe that someone is in inevitable danger, they can also go right in. The baby's screams became choking coughs, and I heard a thump loudly inside. I hopped up the steps and prepared to launch my shoulder into the door. A tiny voice in my head urged me to see if it was unlocked. It should still be locked from last time, but I tried it anyway. It opened a crack, and I was hit with an awful stench. The closest thing I can compare it to is someone with a severe sinus infection who woke up with morning breath, ate rotten eggs, and blew it in your face. I pulled my head back to see a bulging eye staring at me from the top corner of the door, but this eye reflected like a cat or raccoon. It stared down at me with a dotted purple. In the split second before I kicked the door open, I could see the eye glint purple and retreat. I could hear a growl of a dog as the door swung open to darkness within. My flashlight and weapon swung around frantically, searching for a dog or tall intruder with purple eyes. I saw nothing but a small living room. A TV was to my right, a couch to my left, and counter in front of me separating the living room from the kitchen. I could hear the child screaming and coughing from the hallway to my left. I took a couple of tentative steps towards the cries when a figure rushed out of the hallway towards me. I let out a yell and leveled my Glock to fire. I thank God I froze for an instant instead of shooting reflexively. In the split second that followed, I saw the mother with her head tilted sideways and her eyes rolled back. Her arms were trailing limply behind her as she fell. I sidestepped out of her way, and she crumpled to the floor beside me with a thud. Hindsight 2020, maybe I should have caught her, but part of me knew she had been thrown, so I kept my weapon aimed down the hallway. Or that's what I tell myself anyway. The hallway was only 6 feet long, a bedroom to the right and left with a bathroom in the middle. I had been in countless trailers with this layout. The bathroom door was closed, so whoever threw her could be to the right or the left taking cover. I could see both of the doors were open. I spared a glance down at the woman. She was on her side facing me, young and attractive. She was only in a light shirt and underwear. Her eyes were open, and she was breathing in quick, short bursts. Her eyes had a trance-like stare, and I could see her skin glistened with a layer of sweat. I couldn't see blood or physical injuries on her, but she reminded me of a fish taken out of water, slowly dying. When I returned my gaze to the hallway, my brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It appeared the hallway had gotten longer. Where my flashlight had once illuminated the bathroom door, now there was only pitch black. I moved my flashlight back and forth to reveal the darkness was a fixed object, like a cloud at the lip of the doorway. Even as I squinted and tried to grasp what I was seeing, the darkness seemed to grow closer. It leaped out like a fog into the living room. The door frame faded to blackness, then the walls around it, then the parts of the couch beside it. The best way I can explain is it looked like the world in front of me was disappearing and being swallowed by the void. The dark reached across the room to flood after me. I looked down to see the world drop off into nothingness about a foot away. The bare legs of the woman lying beside me had already been consumed by it. I tried in vain to wave away the darkness with my light to no avail. I backed into the TV and knocked it over. The familiar panic began to boil over within me as the dark whispers tore through my mind again. It was the same despair I had felt in the car. I wasn't afraid of dying on the job, but this was different. What was this darkness? What unimaginable terror awaited for me in the approaching void? Would it take me to hell? If I died here, would God even see me? The darkness was right out of arm's reach when the glow of my flashlight was snuffed out and I was plunged into absolute darkness. My last light of hope disappearing caused a primal scream to build up in my throat. One last terrified plea before the madness overtook me. Oh, God! Oh, Jesus! I blinked rapidly as my flashlight sprung back to life, illuminating the room around me. The unnatural darkness had retreated. I blinked repeatedly as the horrid thoughts flew from me, leaving me shaking and whimpering. I fought the urge to run out the door and forgot stupid ideas like honor and duty. As I supported myself against the TV, leaning against the wall, I began to catch my breath. I did a couple of rounds of combat breathing to lower my racing heart. I also let out a curse word every other exhale. I had a job to do, and I knew I had to replace a paralyzing fear with something else. Life had taught me anger could override fear and push you past exhaustion at a pinch. I also steadied myself with a mental checklist. I would finish this call. I would find the baby, call an ambulance for Mom, and stop Zeke. Or whatever it was out here. Then I could go 10-8 and drink coffee at the office. Everything would be normal. I knelt to check on the mother. She wouldn't respond to anything I asked her. Her pupils were as big as saucers and showed no reaction to my light. A brief pat-down revealed no apparent injuries. But then I heard it again. The soft cry of an infant. But it wasn't coming from the hallway. It sounded closer. I shot up and immediately saw a figure to the right of my periphery. I twirled to highlight a dark figure of a person standing in the kitchen. The figure's back was turned to me with shoulders hunched. It wore a ratty black raincoat, torn and frayed. "Let me see your hands," I yelled. The figure didn't budge. I could hear him mumbling as he bobbed his shoulder. "Hey, listen to me, asshole. I swear I'll shoot you. Hands up and turn around slowly." I could hear him start softly cooing. "But my hands are full, deputy," he croaked as he slowly turned around. It was Zeke, and he was cradling the baby in his arms. My whole body tensed up at this sight. The child couldn't have been more than a year old. I could see the child moving its arms and wiggling about, thank God for that, but Zeke's grip was firmly around the base of its skull. His disgusting hand palmed its delicate head like he was holding a baseball. The dirty nail on his pointer finger gently taps the child's nose. I mentally weighed my options. Seeing Zeke holding the child reminded me of how terrified I felt when I first held my newborn nephew. He was so fragile. I thought I could crush him by accident. I knew Zeke was playing upon that fear to keep me at bay. I could shoot him in the face. It wouldn't be the hardest shot to make. He wasn't but 7 feet from me, but he would drop the baby. After sensing my thoughts, Zeke let go of the child's head and dangled it upside down by the leg. Now the child commenced screaming as it swung back and forth like a pendulum. Zeke outstretched his arm, presenting the baby to me, and purposefully holding the baby directly in front of the muzzle of my gun. "Ooh, take the shot. Kill the bad guy. Save the family. It's what you trained for all these years," he continued, as he took a step towards me, shortening the distance to about 4 feet. I could see the tears pouring out of the child's chubby face and running down his forehead to sprinkle onto the floor. I pulled my gun away from the child and held it close to my chest, terrified to have something so dangerous so close to something so precious. I took half a step back when I realized I was losing my one advantage. Zeke thought I had tunnel vision on shooting him. He expected me to step back and keep my distance like cops were trained to do. But I always liked a good fight. I quickly came up with a plan to holster my weapon while rushing him. I'd grab the baby with my offhand while giving him a low kick right to the knee. I'd catch him off guard by sprinting my attack in the middle of telling him something everybody knew. Hey, Zeke, listen to me. You have the right to remain silent. My gun started to lower to my holster, my offhand pointing the light in his eyes. Anything you say can be used against you. A grin began to widen on Zeke's face. If you cannot afford I tensed to attack. Zeke whipped the baby into the air. Time slowed around me as I saw the child arch upwards to almost hit the ceiling. I must have instinctively dropped my weapon in light as my arms reached to catch the child as it descended. My hands searched the darkness where my brain predicted the falling child should be. I felt its soft body and eagerly pulled the child to my chest. The instant my brain confirmed I had secured the infant, my eyesight exploded with stars as my head rocked back. While reeling backwards, another blow hit the inside of my right knee. I buckled and fell to my back, the gear on my duty belt painfully jamming into me. The entire time, my arms desperately wrapped around the screaming child. I immediately began frantically searching the ground around me with my right hand. I couldn't let Zeke get my weapon. I began to sit up and roll to my side in a desperate attempt to shield the baby. I received a crushing knee to the belly as Zeke landed on me with all of his weight. I let out a grunt of pain and wrapped the child tighter to my chest. He straddled me and pulled himself closer by the collar over my vest. I could smell his telltale stench cascading off of him. His enlarged eyes stared into mine. I realized with horror that Zeke had no intention of going for my gun. With a crazed smile on his face, he embraced me in a hug and began to squeeze. He was going to squeeze the life out of the baby. I had to recall my searching right hand to push back against Zeke. We struggled like that for what seemed like an eternity. He was mounted on top of me, giving me a bear hug, and I desperately tried pushing him away with my right hand while shielding the baby with my left. I knew the amount of force he was putting on me was unnatural. He was wiry and about 6 inches shorter than me. I had at least 40 pounds in the guy, and I was in decent shape. But I felt my back crack as I gasped as my muscles were quickly pushed to the point of muscle failure. The poor child began to wheeze as our bodies were sandwiched in. I was getting desperate, and my mind brought up a memory I had tucked away for a rainy day, hoping I never had to use it. I remembered a salty former Devil Dog SWAT instructor teaching us room-clearing tactics in the academy. It was the end of the day, and he began to share war stories about his time. Most people don't know the quickest way to kill somebody is putting your thumb right through the bad guy's eye socket, he said with a wicked smile, mimicking the action by thrusting his gnarled thumb with a quick jab. Straight into the brain, he finished, as he twisted his thumb and made a squish sound with his mouth. Yeah, my body cringed just like yours as you listened to this. He must have seen the group of us cadets physically withdraw and continued. The trick is getting your brain to override your sense of basic human decency and kill another human in this horrific way. Your mind will fight you on it. It's not natural to want to do this to your fellow man. Even now that you know it, you won't be able to do it when the time comes. I was used to the mind games and hazing from alpha military types, and trying to scare us into quitting. I thought about what he had said that day, unsure if I could kill or maim someone in such a horrible way. I'd have to exhaust all other options. But now, as I lay on my back, my body failing and a child being crushed between us, I had to dig deep to survive. Zeke blinked for the first time during this whole confrontation. A look of realization passed over him. He grinned even wider as he began to chuckle. He released me from his hug and quickly grabbed my head with both hands. His thumb moved from my eyes. I closed them as I felt his dirty thumbnails scrape across my eyelids. Panic leaped inside of me as I realized what he was doing. Even though my eyes were closed, I had a mental picture of where he was. My right hand struck out, and my thumb pierced through something smooth and soft. Warm liquid immediately engulfed my hand and splashed across my face. I didn't realize I was screaming until copper-tasting liquid poured into my mouth. I could taste what it was, and I knew what I had done. But I had to open my eyes to see. Zeke's grip had slackened enough to open my eyes to peek at the damage. Sure enough, my thumb was deeply embedded in Zeke's left eye socket. He still grinned maniacally at me as blood oozed out of him. I pushed him up and away from me as I bucked and twisted frantically. He finally rolled off to my left and my thumb came free of his eye socket. I heard him kicking and thumping away from me as he retreated into the darkness. I sat up with the child and quickly searched to my right for my gun. I found it and quickly snatched it up and scanned the room. I didn't see Zeke, but I scanned back and forth repeatedly. The child resumed its deafening scream, and I could feel my heart pounding through my entire body. After a couple of moments of pointing my weapon at the dark and cradling the child, my mind began to work again. I noticed how strange my weapon felt in my blood-covered hand. I noticed the screaming baby sounded loud and healthy. And I noticed we were both alone. Alone! The child's mother was missing. I sat there overwhelmed, but first things first, I had to deal with the infant in my arms. Retrieving my light, I slowly stood and searched the room for a safe place to lay my screaming bundle. I settled with placing the baby on the floor and building up a pillow fort around it with throw pillows. I could feel precious seconds being wasted. With trepidation, I stood to face the hallway. Zeke must have taken the mother back there. I stepped forward, deciding on the door to my right first. My kick blasted the door open as light flooded the room. It revealed a woman's bedroom that had been completely trashed. It looked like an explosion had occurred from a large hole in the center of the room. Wood and the torn carpet were scattered all across the area. The flooring was bent up and outwards like something had come through from the bottom. I leaned over the hole to see down into the muddy ground beneath. Is this how Zeke had got in? It looked like the Hulk had smashed his way up through the floor. Any other time I wouldn't believe it, but sanity had left the moment I was dispatched to this house. I knew he could still be down there with her. If I crawled down there, I'd be putting myself in dangerously tight corridors with Zeke again. I didn't want another wrestling rematch with his freakish strength. A bolt of lightning crashed somewhere close, the bright strobe outlining a tall figure outside the bedroom window. I looked up to only catch a glimpse of it before it vanished. But it was an imposing humanoid figure of blackness with purple reflecting eyes. It must have been 10 feet tall, pressing its hands and face against the other side of the glass. As quickly as I saw it, it winked out of existence. Only the afterimage of it in my mind. I shuffled around the hole to look out the window. Standing further out in the backyard was a group of shadows. I didn't have to wait long for another lightning strike to illuminate the night. What the light exposed hardly surprised me, but made me shudder anyway. It was Zeke, soaking in the rain. His outstretched arm held the mother up by the back of her neck to face me. The unnatural ease in which he held her outwards was as effortless as he had held the baby. It was as if he was presenting her to me. A twisted grin dominated his bloodied, one-eyed face as she hung limply. He beckoned me with his free hand to come before turning curtly and strolling for the woods with her. I spat a curse at him as he faded into the trees. I had to get her back. I couldn't care less if he got away in the end, but I couldn't live with my final memory of her being taken by that grinning cyclops. He had sought her out this night. I had to stop whatever morbid plans he had for her. I ran back into the kitchen and located a back door. I flew out into the cold rain, jumping down the slick steps and sprinting towards the woods. I could see where the foliage parted to make a small pathway. This was around the place where I last spotted Zeke. He must have taken it. Once I hit the tree line, my momentum almost came to a stop. The water sloshed up to my knees as I took heavy steps forward. After trudging a few yards into the woods, I spotted a glimpse of movement pulling away from me. Every time I thought I lost Zeke's trail, I would see him slipping further into the dark, dragging the poor woman with him. My legs burned as I forced myself through the deep foliage. I tried to keep Zeke in my sights through blinding trees and vines. I don't know how long I chased after him. Time did its weird thing again. I fell into a fugue state of desperation and exhaustion. All I knew was that I had to keep moving forward. Though I was surrounded by a thick forest, I felt isolated, like I was floating in the void of space, or standing at the edge of a great chasm. The darkness outside the reach of my light was a void into nothing. It seemed only the immediate area where I stood was solid. The only things tangible around me were the figures my light discovered. As soon as I moved past the ground I stood on, or my light passed by the surroundings, the matter returned to nothing. I could fall into the abyss and never be heard from again. Another soul lost to the forest. How long would it take before people noticed I was missing? And maybe it would be deemed important enough for a small local news report. My sheriff might call in reserves and troopers to have the woods search for me. But after a couple of weeks it would be called off, and too expensive to keep it up. I know because I've seen it happen a couple of times. I would just be gone. No one would really know I had been swallowed up by despair. I had glitched out of this reality to be forever fallen into darkness. In my grim reverie of stalking after Zeke, I was vaguely aware of something shadowing me. From my peripherals, I would catch the dark figure with purple eyes keeping pace with me. I could smell the stink of BO and bad breath wafting around me. I wanted to turn my head and face the creature directly, but was too afraid to lose track of Zeke. He was pulling further and further away from me as my body screamed to rest. Zeke disappeared through some shrubbery, and I yelled in frustration as I urged myself to speed up. The corners of my vision faded, and I knew I was on the verge of passing out. On the cusp of falling into the water in exhaustion, I broke through the shrubs and entered a clearing. I looked around in wonder. A perfect circle with a 30-yard diameter. In the middle of the clearing stood an old tree stump jutting 3 feet out of the water. I could see a small sapling shooting out of the dead tree, its skinny branches reaching out about 15 feet above the water. With a flash of lightning, I noticed Zeke standing next to the tree, holding the slumping woman by the collar. He had his hand reached up, playing with something swinging from the tree. As I stumbled over, I could see it was a noose. "Oh, something old for something new," Zeke proclaimed loudly, still focused on the noose. "This is what my Jesus demands." The way he said "my Jesus" made it clear it wasn't the Jesus Joel Osteen was peddling. He finally turned to face me. With an effortless and fluid motion, he hoisted the limp woman atop the stump. "Oh, it's got to be something sweet," he says. Zeke groaned, his one eye throwing daggers at me. "Maybe it can be you. Let's see what he says. But someone hangs from the tree, but I want you. You and the baby are just a bonus. After the massacre, I'll return to stomp the life out of the child." I had about enough of this cryptic voodoo talk and threats. I knew I couldn't take him hand to hand, but now he couldn't use the woman as a shield. I leveled my pistol and fired 2 quick bursts. My ears rang after the shots. The smell of gunpowder enveloped me. I closed the gap between us to about 5 yards. An easy shot. So why didn't Zeke go down? Not even a flinch. I figured excitement and heart rate had made me miss. In anger, I squeezed off 5 more rounds while marching towards him. It felt like I was shooting through his shadow. He just stared at me with his cyclops eye. When I came to within about 7 feet, I stopped. We stared at each other for a while, him glaring while I breathed raggedly. The only movement was the downpour around us. I knew I was out of options. It began to dawn on me I was going to die out here with the girl. We both were. I couldn't save her. I had chosen to chase this possessed man to the place I would never return. A willing sacrifice. A mental picture flashed through my head. I'd be laid out on the tree stump like a tribute on an altar, while the woman hung lifeless from the branch above me. Zeke smiled and gave me a short laugh. He stretched his arms out wide as if welcoming me for a hug. That's when I saw it. No more hiding in the corners of my vision. It revealed itself to me. A tall figure peeked out from the hangman tree behind Zeke, its purple eyes glinting. I saw it clearly as I ever could. The inky black profile of a humanoid standing there 3 feet taller than Zeke. It was made out of the same unnatural blackness that had almost consumed me back in the house. My light was useless at dispersing it. It stretched out an unnaturally long hand to lay it atop Zeke's head. Zeke closed his remaining eye and began to quiver, shaking like a Holy Ghost televangelist. No, deputy, Zeke spoke in a throaty crackle. He jerked his head from side to side, the entity never releasing his grip. Zeke gave a terrible cough and heaved his chest like he was about to throw up. It was as if his body was trying to reject the monster leeching off of him. My Jesus has made a decision. He wants the woman. She has a sweetness most deserving defilement. A kindness to rip and tear. Her desecration will be an agony felt most by those who love her. In return, I receive his gifts, the fruits of the Spirit. Once again, I felt the world around me fall out of focus. Some dark magic was pulling me under a trance. The veil of reality thinned, and the cold darkness waited for my soul to fall in. I was so tired. Why fight it? I lazily put my gun back into its holster and nonchalantly dropped my light into the water. I felt the cold creep up my body like terrible claws. The unnatural cold took over me, and I realized I couldn't move. Or I didn't want to move. It didn't matter. I noticed the rain had stopped, and turned off like a switch. I moved my eyes around in my frozen head to see millions of droplets frozen in the air. It was as if time had stopped and the rain was suspended like little planets floating against a dark galaxy. Zeke looked up and marveled at the sight. The dark entity moved out from behind the tree. My eyes were adjusted enough to the moonlight in the clearing to see the inky black mass getting closer. Panic rose within me. I didn't want the thing to get any closer. I didn't want it to touch me. I just knew if it touched me, it would be the most violating thing ever. But I still didn't move. It was useless to resist. The darkness was inevitable. It lowered itself in front of me, its glinting saucer eyes staring into mine. Of course, the overwhelming smell followed. It reached out a pitch-black hand to lay on top of my head. When it touched, a jolt of energy shot through me. I could feel its hate, its disgust towards me. But it wasn't just me, it was everything. Even Zeke. Zeke was just a means to an end. A plaything used to spread wrath and hurt others. But then the real event started. As I stood there dumbstruck, it showed me things. I saw the woman standing. It told me her name was Alyssa. She wore the same blank look I had. Then realization flooded back into her face. She blinked rapidly and began to whimper. She made eye contact with Zeke, me, and then the dark figure. Her eyes bulged as if pleading for escape. What followed, I'm not sure of. Time was hard to measure, but it felt like an eternity. I don't know if it was real or a trance, maybe a little of both. Both of us locked away in a crack in reality. A crack that let the darkness in to infect and corrupt. I stood motionless with tears streaming down my face as they tortured Alyssa in front of me. Zeke ravaged her in countless ways with the entity hovering closely over his shoulder. Knives and cutting instruments would be handed to him out of the dark mass of the thing. They committed acts of violence I'll never repeat, never write, never speak. But I could see Alyssa felt all of it. She would scream through gritted teeth, her eyes bulging so much it seemed as if they would pop. At the end of the mutilation, Alyssa would always end up hanging from the noose. In a malicious display of sadism, Alyssa would be granted the use of her desecrated body. She would thrash around and weakly try to free herself from the rope around her neck. She never got free. But right before she stopped struggling, the scene would reset. Jump back in time, she'd be completely healed and standing in the water, trapped in her own body, waiting the ritual to begin again. I don't know how long it went on. Maybe hours, maybe days. Time had no meaning. As the macabre show played out on repeat again and again, I began to lose hope just as assuredly as Alyssa might have. I had given up. I'd failed. I was a fool and deserved this cruel fate. I maybe even deserved worse. I deserved worse. It was this self-defeating statement that turned out to be my salvation. The lifeline to pull me out of the bottomless pit I was sinking in. But at first it was just another arrow to my heart. Another stone tied to my feet. I did deserve worse. It should be me standing up there. I had taken the job to help people like her. How I had failed. Standing on the sidelines, watching this mother be assaulted on repeat. I had no kids. I was just a single useless man. Nobody would really miss me. Not like her. I should take her place. This thought sparked through my mind like lightning. It was my job to stand in front of the innocent when the wolf came. Zeke spoke of sacrifice. I could take her place, and maybe find some semblance of honor for my pathetic actions. I felt a warm spark begin to grow inside of me. Zeke had cut Alyssa hundreds of times and now led her to step on the stump so he could put the rope around her neck. I didn't know what was happening at the time. My brain was still caught in a feverish cycle of hate. Wanting to take her place. Hating that it was her instead of me. I began to regain control of my body. I moved sluggishly towards Zeke, but he was too preoccupied with Alyssa. I saw the entity spin around to face me, its eyes somehow bigger. It let out a deep growl that reverberated in my brain, but it didn't attack. Zeke had fastened the rope around Alyssa's neck and stepped down to admire his work. Alyssa let out an audible whimper as tears flooded her eyes. She knew what was coming. And maybe she prayed she'd be allowed to die this time. "Jump," Zeke said through gritting teeth. Alyssa stepped off the stump and began to choke, her legs kicking slightly as she swung back and forth. I noticed that she didn't even attempt to remove the noose. She had given up. "No!" I screamed as I shouldered past Zeke. He reeled back in surprise. I ran up and grabbed Alyssa's leg and lifted, taking the strain off of her neck. "Let me do it! It needs to be me! Not her! Not her!" I screamed with insane fervor. It took Alyssa a moment to realize I had finally come to her aid. I was screaming for her to be taken off with the noose. She began squirming and pulling at the rope around her neck. I lifted her up further and stabilized her enough to remove the rope and topple us both over into the water. The cold water completely knocked my body out of its sluggish stupor, but my mind was still all haywire. I pulled Alyssa out of the water and leaned her against the tree trunk. She stared back at me and began screaming as she wrapped her arms around me. She hid her face in my chest and refused to look up at the monsters. I could feel her body quivering against mine as she continued to let out muffled screams. I tried to turn to face Zeke, but Alyssa held me too tight. So I just looked over my shoulder. I noticed it was raining again, and time was unfrozen. "No, take me instead. She's had enough. She's done. I'm a willing sacrifice. Let her sins be mine." I don't know where that last sentence came from. Divine intervention? I don't know. My mind was still in a tailspin of misery. All I know is the entity didn't like it. I heard an unnatural yell. A bark? A growl? The closest thing I can compare it to is a mix between a baboon and a jaguar. It was terrifying, and I knew it came from the tall shadow. As if it was a command, Zeke started raining down blows on my head, pounding hammer fists over and over. I squeezed Alyssa closer to shield her from the blows. I could take the pain. I wanted it. Zeke then tried to pull me off of her, but I held on. That's when I realized Zeke had lost his strength. Sure, his blows hurt, but they were the blows of a normal man. He couldn't even pull me away from Alyssa. A small beacon of hope bloomed in my soul. Zeke was tiring. Zeke began cursing me. Hopefully he was reading my mind as I thought the most heinous things about him. Then he reached for the gun in my hip. I have a level 3 retention holster, meaning you have to press a button, push it down, and rock it forward to release it from the holster. It takes practice, but Zeke manipulated it smoothly and pulled it away from me. I half turned to face Zeke, still shielding Alyssa away from him. Zeke huffed and pointed my gun at me with a shaky hand. "You die for her, pig?" he screamed at me. "Yeah, you backwards inbred," I spat back in defiance. I had already accepted my fate. If I was to die, at least let it mean Alyssa would survive. One honorable thing during a life of failure. "I'll kill you, then I'll take your girl anyways," Zeke shrieked. I closed my eyes and waited for the hot bullets to pierce my body. What does being shot feel like? Will he make it quick and go for the head? Closed casket for sure. But the shots never came. 10 seconds felt like 10 hours before I opened my eyes. Zeke's face was one of confusion. His body quivered as his eye twitched around in its socket. That's when I noticed the entity had placed a hand on the back of Zeke's head. Zeke grit his teeth and let out a huff of frustration. It didn't take me long to realize that Zeke was frozen like Alyssa and I had been. "Let me do it," Zeke begged. The muscles in his neck strained and his outstretched arm twitched. I could tell Zeke desperately wanted to put the required pressure on the trigger to blow my face off. He tried to look at the entity even though his head couldn't move. The creature got inches from him, just outside of his field of vision, and began to whisper in his ear. Zeke's expression transformed from anger to fear. "No, we had an agreement," Zeke pleaded. His hands sprung open and dropped the gun with a splash. Now his expression turned to anger. "You forsake me? You liar! I still have time. I still have power. He's just a damn idiot. I'll get you the girl." The entity shot another hand into Zeke's chest and let out a sharp hiss. Zeke's face contorted in pain and he began to cough. The shadow creature grew bigger, towering over Zeke, and it slowly pulled him into its dark mass, enveloping him. Zeke began to cry out in high-pitched yelps as his body disintegrated into the blackness. He looked like he was bent over backwards with the entity pushing him inwards by the top of his head. Before his head was consumed, he looked at me and begged, "Just a little more power. Let me kill this cop." Then Zeke's head was pushed in and he was no more. Only the looming shadow creature with purple glinting eyes. I cradled Alyssa's drenched and shaking body tightly. I tried to meet the creature's piercing stare, but it was too much. It projected so much anger into my heart. I knew this was the end. At least Zeke wouldn't get the satisfaction. But I didn't know what untold horrors the creatures would perform on me. Maybe I'd be taken away like Zeke, locked away within this unholy creature. "Just leave her," I said. The entity just stared back silently, the rain wiping around it. Then I heard a deep rumbling coming from it. Was it laughter? It was. A wicked sound. It began to back away from me as the deep chuckle continued. The thing made it to the edge of the tree line, and all I could see was its reflecting eyes floating in the storm. And just like that, it disappeared. Just like that, it was over. It took a minute for it to register with my rattled mind, but I knew in my heart it had left. The fog over my soul had lifted. I sat Alyssa on the stump and stared up into the sky. The rain felt refreshing instead of drowning. I won't bore you with the after-action report or the mountain of paperwork that followed, but I fished my gun out of the water and I silently helped Alyssa limp back to her home. Not a word said between us. What was there to say? Oh, and backup still wasn't there yet. The baby was fine, if not a little bruised, and the EMTs took Alyssa to the hospital. She had returned to a semi-catatonic state, not saying anything for about a week. She did finally start talking again, but claimed she didn't remember anything. I consider it a mercy. She and her child went to live with her parents. They told me she had extreme night terrors every night, but quickly forgot them upon waking. Hopefully, she can have a normal life for her child. But she'll never be the same. Evil had left its stain on her. I cut my report short and sweet. I wisely chose to admit the shadow monster and the hell dimension of torture Alyssa was in. I left out the part about emptying 7 rounds into an unkillable demon-powered man. I just told the narrative of chasing Zeke out of the house and into the woods where I rescued Alyssa. Oh, and Zeke may have an injury to his eye. It was too dark to tell how bad I had hurt him. That same night, Zeke's brother had died. It was in the papers the next day. He was locked up in the neighboring county. He had suffered a heart attack in his cell. There was a whole investigation. The video showed him banging on the door and crying for help. But there was a big fight in another part of the jail. Nobody heard or paid attention to his cries as he died alone. I stayed with the department for another month. They put a warrant out on Zeke for burglary and assaulting a peace officer. But I never expected him to turn up. Until one day he did. My sergeant had come into the office with a big smile on his face. He let me know they had found my guy. He said Zeke was found on some hunting lease in a neighboring county. Sarge slapped down a folder with pictures in it. I opened it to see a familiar sight. A clearing with the tree stump in the middle. Another younger tree growing out of the middle of it. And there hung the body of Zeke, dangling from the noose. His body bloated and rotten. I turned the page to see the picture with a closer look. He wore the ratty black raincoat and his left eye was missing. What happened? I asked incredulously. Well, some old hunter found Zeke about a week ago. I guess he got tired of running and offed himself. My sergeant spoke matter-of-factly. The strange thing is, the coroner said he'd been up there for months. And kinda messes up your whole timetable of events. And maybe the doc's a quack. The summer heat does speed up decomposition. He was at least up there long enough for the birds to get at his eyes. I felt sick. I had a strange feeling that the Zeke I had encountered had somehow been hanging from the tree at the same time. Some sort of cruel trick played out by the power of the purple-eyed shadow. I don't know how I knew this. It was like I had always known. Before my sergeant walked into his office, he turned to face me. Can you believe bullets were found in him? Post-mortem, they say. But people must have hated him enough to do some target practice instead of reporting him. I left the department shortly after that. See, I had been changed too, like Alyssa. Driving alone at night, I'd be terrified of the shadows moving in my peripherals, hoping that I wouldn't catch a glint of purple. I knew that thing was still out there waiting for me on every call I went to. I could turn any corner to see it looming there, staring at me with his hate-filled eyes. I don't know what stopped him from taking me that night, or why he stilled Zeke's hand from pulling the trigger. Maybe it was my willingness to sacrifice myself. Something pure amid evil. I hope it was. Rather it be the Harry Potter logic or Sunday school logic. I don't care. No greater love, right? But then there's the darker thought. The one that keeps me up at night. I volunteered. I made a deal. Maybe the thing decided to honor my deal over Zeke's. Maybe I owe a debt that hasn't been paid yet. The entity is just waiting, hoping I'll forget before he comes for me, and pushing me into the void like he did Zeke. I work at another police department now. I took a step back to work in dispatch, but the call of the wild still affects me. I want to get back in black and white and be in the field. I know I can't live in fear. I have to reclaim my life. A test for a patrol position is coming up and I've already signed up. But there's a part of me I suppress every day just to keep moving. It lingers in the recesses of my mind. I just know it for some reason, like I do other dark things now. Whether on my deathbed at 90 or answering another disturbance call tomorrow, I'll see it again. It's inevitable. It knows me now. It marked me. The purple eyes filled with hate. The Jesus of Zeke. I watched the boy with interest as he toyed around with the symbols on the floor. He had cut the inside of his forearm and was smearing the blood on the kitchen tile to create the summoning sigil. I blew out a tired breath over my bifurcated tongue and blinked through the nictitating membrane of my eyes. It was going to be one of those nights. He was one of those people, the kind that just had to throw in a macabre touch to everything they did. Blood was uncalled for, and frankly cliched as well. If he had the means to, he would likely have tried to sacrifice a goat as well. However, looking over the apartment, it was clear from his squalid living conditions that he likely couldn't afford a goat. He likely had spent his earnings on the black wax candles that he had placed around the circle. I could see him, but he couldn't see me yet. That was the problem with making the sigil too early. It opened a conduit through which I could see into the mortal plane. You'd be surprised how many times someone accidentally created a demonic sigil while trying to make a haunted park attraction look scary or a hot topic edgy. My summoning sigil is a fairly simple design after all. In the state, I could only watch. He still needed to invoke my presence. Hopefully, he wouldn't try the summoning ritual in Latin. Tibi magnum inno me namadum, signa stellarum nigrarum me vocer ti aca manu. Shit. He was pacing back and forth, reading the words aloud as if trying to figure out the correct accents and inflections. Each attempt was somehow worse than the last. I tried my best to piece together the invocation and make sense of what he was trying to say, but it was jumbled like he had plugged the words into Google Translate. At around the 7th attempt at butchering an already dead language, I grew tired of waiting and decided to step through. It was better to get this over with now than spend my entire night in this dingy apartment. I spoke. Seriously, did you even bother to translate it? What you just said, is this in English? To you, the great not-to-be-named, signs of the black stars, I summon you Akamana. First off, I think you owe Lovecraft royalties for ripping off that line. Second, why would you call me one not-to-be-named, and then proceed to name me? What am I, Voldemort? Besides, if I knew you were going to butcher the language, Why not just stick to invoking me with my sigil? He looked up from his phone where he had Googled the words with a deer-in-headlights expression. I tend to get this look a lot at first. Summoners always have this image in their mind of a muscular, red-skinned demon with hooked claws and a goat head. I'm none of those things. God was my creator as well. Why would we be made in the image of cutting claws, masticating mandibles, and grotesque sucking appendages? God had a pattern that he stuck with. Humans, demons, angels. We all look relatively the same. Yet we're so different. I clarified for him. Think of it like this. If God is your father, then Satan is your cousin. Why would we look completely different from you? So, you're like me? I made a wry face and shook my head. You didn't summon me here to chat, did ya? He spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. You're bound to me. You must do my bidding. I chuckled. Oh, that's not how it works. I stepped over the seal and brought myself closer to him. He stumbled back and toppled over a chair. He whimpered impotently. But I had a demon trap. You were supposed to be trapped there. That's the problem with writing in blood. One break in the pattern and it's all void. In this instance, it was those overpriced candles you likely picked up at Hot Topic which resulted in breaks around the outer circle. Please don't flay me and mutilate my corpse. What? Why would I? Never mind. Not even going to touch that one. What purpose would serve for me to kill you? Word of mouth gets around and suddenly summoning Akamana is akin to instant death? No, that's bad publicity. I'm here to make a deal. You summoned me here for that, right? He paused for a moment, deciding to bury the initial fear, and said, What do you want in exchange? My soul? I laughed. Oh, your soul? Sorry, but what the hell would I do with your soul? It's an insubstantial thing. It's about as valuable as your virginity. He winced. I had hit a sore topic. Your servitude and pledge are what really matter here. In exchange for my assistance, you will spread the word about me. There's power to be had in influence, and there is strength to be found in the servitude of others. He spoke, anger tinging his voice. And what if I back out of the deal? What are you gonna do? He was angry about the virginity comment. A virgin, or possibly, you would regret it. I left it at that, knowing his imagination would fill in the blanks and paint tortures worse than anything I could even manage. Man always did have a knack for ingenuity. He blanched at the thought. I knew he'd be mine, and he would do exactly what I wanted. There was only the small matter of the deal and its components. He paused, as if weighing his words. He had an endless sea of choices before him, and the opportunity to select only one. Did he want power, wealth, knowledge? His hands clenched by his sides, his cuticles turned white as he spoke. His anger was palpable. I want you to torment someone for me. I listened patiently as he vented vitriol. Beth Gallagher, that bitch, I want her to suffer. I want her nights to be haunted. I want her to lie awake in her bed, wondering when it was in her life that everything went wrong for her. I want misfortune to dog her every step of the way until she's so beaten down that the thought of doing anything rolls in her stomach like curdled milk. He continued. His voice rose and turned bitter. I want you to turn her dreams, hopes, and aspirations into ashes in her mouth. I want her to suffer every indignity imaginable. I want you to rot her womb so her children are stillborn and every conception aborts in the wasteland that her body has become. I want... What did she do to you? His invective halted. What does it matter? Do I need a reason to hate someone? What a human thought. If God were so interested in what was going on down here, he'd weep. Are you going to do what I ask, or do I have to summon someone else? His attempt to force my hand would not go ignored or unpunished. I nodded my head and said, What you ask will be done. I will make Beth summon innumerable horrors. And truly, the things you humans do because of love never ceases to astound me. He grit his teeth so hard I thought they would shatter and chip in his mouth. I loved her. She didn't love me. You say loved her, but that's wrong. No one would do this to another person if they didn't still have feelings for them. Rejection and love, hand in hand, bred this. I stepped back into the ineffective demon trap, ready to be gone from this world. He said nothing. His mouth open like a gutted fish gasping out its last moments. I didn't need to stick around. I would carry out my end of the bargain and hex this woman. He would spread word about me and convince more to summon me. He would lie awake at night with the realization that he had done all of this to the woman he loved. The more knowledge there was about me, the greater my influence would grow. Another thrall to evangelize my existence. The entire ordeal left me drained. It wasn't the energy I had exerted from being summoned. Slipping into and out of the world was like stepping through a pool of water. Easy, with no resistance. I was a welcome guest here. I had other reasons for my exhaustion. Humans have a tendency to do that to me. They can do something like that to the person they love. And yet they call us demons. I watched as she shuffled her way into the church. The building was empty. Typically, a priest lived on the grounds, but he had decided to take a brief sabbatical. The only ones in the church were Beth, Gallagher, and I, which would make our encounter go so much smoother. She didn't know my name, but she was about to summon me. All people in trying times make supplications to me whether they know it or not. Abraham called out to me when the time came to sacrifice his son, and I had shown him compassion. I am Zadkiel, the angel of mercy. Beth had fallen on hard times since the curse had laid upon her a few years back. One of her legs had been broken in a car accident years ago, and it had never healed right. She was covered in carbuncles that tore open and wet pus at the slightest movement, which stung like salt poured into a wound. Her musculature had been degenerated by wasting diseases. She had been living on a friend's couch for the past month, but they were about to kick her out and she knew it. She had nowhere else to go, and as people always do in these situations, she turned to faith. Her faith was nothing spectacular. Like many, she had lost it in her youth. She had become disenchanted with the world, and it soon spread and contaminated her faith. It didn't take long before it rotted to the core. She knelt in the first row and made the sign of the cross. I silently touched down a few rows behind her. She hadn't become aware of my presence yet. I heard the words, though she wasn't speaking them aloud. Even if they weren't actually audible, to me they came out like a desperate scream. I need help. I don't know how it got so bad or what I've done to deserve this, but I can't take it anymore. My friends are gone. I'm about to be homeless, and every moment of my life is spent in fear and agony. I'm at my limit. I don't even know if you even exist, but if you do, why? Why are you doing this to me? I need your help."
"I can help you." Beth whirled about in the direction my voice was coming from. I slowly began to materialize in front of her. If I were too sudden in my appearance, I would startle her and maybe even send her running from the church. I had once looked resplendent like one of the heavenly host, but my time amongst the living had begun to take its toll on me. My skin was beginning to turn gray and mottled. Feathers had begun to fall off of my wings, revealing the pale, almost translucent flesh beneath. My veins rose out of my skin like tiny, blue, wriggling worms. Beth gasped in shock, and I reassured her. "Fear not, child of man. One cannot exist in both heaven and earth without being altered. They are two different worlds with two different environments. You wouldn't be able to live in heaven with your corporeal form, and my time spent on earth has taken its toll on me. What you see before you is a product of the time I have spent here helping people." That explanation seemed to put her at ease. She spoke slowly, as if uncertain of the question itself.
"Are you an angel?"
I unfurled my wings, carefully, so as not to lose any more of my feathers, and answered, "Yes, daughter of clay. I am a son of fire born from God's hand, just as he has shaped you. I have come here to answer your call for salvation."
"How?"
"You have cried out to me amidst your suffering, and I have heard your supplications."
"Why is all of this happening?"
"A shadow hangs over you, tainting all of your endeavors and poisoning your plans. This shadow was set upon you by a spurned man to break you down and make you suffer. You rejected him, and in his scorn, he called forth an infernal entity to visit tragedy upon tragedy on you." She sat down as if the revelation was too much for her. She wept into her rough and calloused hands. A sore on the corner of her mouth dribbled out a viscous, straw-colored fluid that mingled with her tears. I stood in the aisle, waiting for her to regain her composure. It took her a few moments before she wiped the snot and tears away and asked,
"What is going to happen to him?"
She meant the one who had put the curse on her in the first place. I took a second to decide whether or not to tell her the truth. "Nothing. The heavenly mandate prevents us from taking justice into our own hands. He is in the employ of a demon. When his end comes, he will burn for his actions, but until then he will not be punished. He will continue his life unaffected and without any repercussions," I answered truthfully. Her face soured for a second. With the lesions, weeping sores, and angry countenance, I thought I was in the presence of a demon rather than a human. There's very little separating angels from humans, and there is even less between demons and them. It didn't take any special insight into the human condition to see the gears in her head turning. She was thinking of revenge. Maybe hunting down the man who placed the curse on her and getting retribution. She was too weak to do that, though. Another possibility about what she may do descended on me like a bolt from the blue. A pact. Beth would summon a demon and pledge herself to them for her justice. I couldn't let that happen. We were already losing far too many people to the temptation of ease and instant gratification. I'd have to do something. I would have to talk her out of it some way. She grew tired of my contemplation and broke my train of thought. Her teeth ground into a snarl and she howled.
That's not fair. Why should I be the one to suffer when he did this all to me? Where's the justice in that? What kind of God?
What right do we have to meet justice based on our own volitions? What do we know of God's plans? Are we wiser than him? If we dealt out retribution for every offense, the world would be nothing but cinders.
She became quiet for a moment before she asked weakly, If you can't punish him for what he's done to me, can you free me from the demon's curse and return me to the way I once was?
Her exertion had left her drained and made her look pitiful. She was in her 30s, but Akabana's influence on her had left her looking like a withered crone. Her skin hung loosely off of her. She was wasting away before my very eyes, and there was nothing I could do.
Well, that wasn't the truth exactly.
No. Once someone has been cursed, it is irreversible. You will carry this affliction until the day you die. Misfortune will dog you until the very end of your life. You will wake up every morning in trepidation of the terrors waiting for you, and you will go to bed wondering what horrors the next day will bring. Your last breath will be pure agony, a cruel coup de grace that culminates from your curse. She exploded to her feet and limped towards me. Anger had clouded her mind and blasted all rational thoughts out of her head. She wanted to rage. She wanted to blame someone for the way the cards had been dealt to her. She snarled.
Then what good are you? You can't save me, and you can't punish the son of a bitch that did this to me. What can you do?
I can give you mercy. My wings folded outward suddenly and encircled her. She tried to back away, but was enclosed and pressed against my almost transparent flesh. She couldn't scream while I held her close and forced the air out of her lungs. She tried to strike me, but her wasting disease had rendered her weak. I barely felt her punches and struggling as I pinioned her to my body. The hand I had used to stay Abraham's dagger slid the same blade into her. It entered right below her rib and angled up into her heart. She tried to scream in surprise, but it came out as a sigh. I wrenched the handle upwards and raked the blade through the tough muscle that was her heart. She expired as I watched the life leave her eyes. I laid her against the pews. A tiny trickle of blood crept from the wound and stained the oak. I stood over her corpse and offered a prayer up for her. Her suffering was finally over. I had freed her from the demon's blight. There was no other way. This world was a cruel place. People suffered excruciating agonies, and the only balm that we had left to offer them was a quick death. I had done God's work. I had saved another poor soul. I smiled at the prospect of carrying out the Lord's will. Beth was gone. Her suffering was over. I stretched out my wings and watched as more feathers sloughed off. I had made my choice. This place was taking its toll on me, but I couldn't leave others to suffer. I flapped my wings and took to the air. I could hear more prayers echoing around me as others pled for salvation. There were more I could save, and I intended to save as many as I could. They all needed my mercy. I knew her complete story the moment I laid eyes on her. Once every couple of years, the heavenly host would send one of the entrants my way. Typically, these people were having difficulties adjusting or they had burning questions that they needed answered. They claimed that this was done to keep me attuned to the people. You make one inquiry about the current state of slavery, and suddenly people view you as antiquated, insensitive, and racist. In reality, they did it as a means of painting a sympathetic face on the omnipotent. She moved carefully into the premium mobile. She was a shaking autumn leaf in a windstorm. They had sent her to me to provide some sort of comfort, a solace of sorts. I would answer any questions she had, or smooth over any difficulties in transition. Looking at her, I could see who she was, and what she actually was. She appeared as what she had wanted to be seen as. She looked to be about 9. She had blonde, sun-kissed hair that flowed down her back. She was a little on the heavier side. Scrapes and bruises marked up her elbows and knees that told of her life as a tomboy. Those were just appearances, however. A facade. I saw through the illusion to what she was at her very core. That wasn't who she was. She didn't have long hair. They had cut it and shaved it down in the end. They said it was to save her the trauma of seeing it fall out. But in actuality, it was to save them the heartache of seeing her deteriorate before their eyes. She wasn't heavy. In fact, she was bone thin. Months of radiation and chemo tend to do that to people. It robbed them of their appetite. The food that they could keep down was typically bland, light, and not very nutritional. Her scrapes and bruises were replaced with bed sores and lesions. She looked around from torch to torch, expecting me to be standing by the flames and warming myself. She expected to see me as a kindly old man, but I was not. Technically, I wasn't in the room. I was the room. I was there. I was everywhere. My form was incorporeal and was spread out every inch of the chamber. I am insubstantial. I am everything. She spoke. Is anyone here? I am. A little bit of biblical humor. It passed over her head completely. She continued. They sent me to you. They said you had the answers. I did, in a sense. I could make anything truth. I could speak words, and my words would become reality. I was the truth. The real trick was making my answer palatable to them. Acceptable. I responded. Speak, my child. I only have time to answer 3 of your questions. The girl paused for a moment, as if considering running out of the room. Talking to thin air was a daunting prospect. She eventually decided the risk of looking foolish was worth the reward. Her voice quavered with her first question. Why do bad things happen to good people? I paused for a moment to consider my response. I had multiple answers, but only one that would sate her curiosity and ease her discomfort. To test their faith and to keep people strong. Without tribulation and trial, people grow complacent. They deteriorate in their faith. Trees without wind lose their branches. My mind traveled back to an image of her. She was in the hospital bed with her toys laid out before her. She had dolls, she had action figures, cards and trinkets from faraway places. Some were gifts from her family and friends. Others were offered to her from nurses and doctors returning from distant locales that sought to give her complacence. They gave her so much, but none of it was what she actually wanted, what she needed. She was angry and a bit jealous. They had given her all of these wonderful things, but had taunted her in other aspects. Sure, she had all of these amazing toys, but didn't have anyone to play with. The hospital ward was empty. Some would call that a miracle, while others would denounce it as a tragedy. There were no kids to play with.
She secretly longed to be outside and feel the sun on her skin and the wind in her hair. She wanted the company of another child, someone to confide in. But that was denied to her. She spent her final moments in loneliness. She interrupted me from my reverie after taking sufficient time to ponder my response and said, "Why do we have to die?" "To give life meaning. If you all lived forever, life would have no meaning. There would be no sense of urgency. The smallest of notions and the grandest of gestures would be rendered pointless if death had no significance. People die, so humanity tries to live to the best of their abilities." I trailed off to her hair. It was once blonde, but the nurses shaved it down before radiation therapy. They called it a kindness. They didn't want her to suffer the cruelty and emotional trauma of watching it come off in patches, to be left as wisps and ghosts of what it once was. They buzzed it off, and a few of the more compassionate nurses joined her. They got their hair razored off alongside her and donated it to the Locks of Love organization. At the end, she looked like a tiny, bald, emaciated alien. She hated losing her golden locks. She wanted to keep them to the very end. She didn't care if she had to watch her hair fall away in clumps. She hated the fatalism of it. She hated the thought that they would shave her down due to the thought that she wasn't strong enough to watch it all fall apart. The worst thing was that one nurse had saved a lock of her hair and bound it into a tiny little doll. The nurse had given it to her as if having a part of what was once her would be a comfort. It was not. It was a reminder. It reminisced of days lost, of moments she couldn't return to. It was a memento mori to her. It was her final question. She could ask me anything. The secret of the universe was in her hands. Why do bad things happen at all? I understand that our faith needs to be tested at times, but why? Why do we need to suffer to this degree? What point was there in suffering the way that I did? Answer me, please. Her voice quavered, and tears began forming in the corners of her eyes. The images overtook me. Her family had stuck with her through the diagnosis, the chemotherapy, and physical degradation. But they weren't there at the conclusion. In the end, she died alone. She died reaching out into the nothingness. A part of her accepted that they didn't want to be there at the end, to witness her final agony. She tried to understand that, but in the end, when death came, those thoughts and reasoning were blasted from her mind. The last words on her lips were her mother and father's names. Her father was in an alleyway when the time came. He had just finished work and stopped at a bar on the way home. He wanted to be somewhere where people didn't know his story, didn't feel sorry for him. He had a few drinks and chatted with a hooker at the bar. At the very end of his daughter's life, he wasn't there. He was cheating on his wife. They eventually retreated to an alley where he gave her $100. She tucked it into her bra and leaned her back against the brick wall. He did what he was there to do. But it didn't matter. It didn't help. But he did find another sort of catharsis. He whimpered into her ear as she stroked his hair in sympathy. He hadn't cried since his daughter's diagnosis, and at the end, this was his only outlet. He was sobbing against her with his pants around his ankles. When his daughter died, her mother was at home when the leukemia took her daughter. She had finished a bottle of wine to fortify her for what she wanted to do. She knew she had to make it quick. Her husband would be home soon, and if she didn't want him to intervene, she'd have to do it now. The tragedy had chipped away at her, and at the end of her daughter's life, she felt like a sand-blasted ruin with nothing left. She was a smooth statue, a symbol of sorrow. As her daughter died, she was on the cusp of taking her own life. She had downed a bottle of red wine and had just pressed a razor into her wrist. She held it vertically, knowing that this was the way to do it. She pressed it so deep into herself that blood had welled up at the surface. All she had to do was drag it up her arm and slice herself open. She had had enough. She was empty. She was a heart-shaped box that had been hollowed out. She closed her eyes in preparation to do it. But in that moment, all she could see were her daughter's eyes. Her hand trembled. Her daughter's angelic face smiled at her through the darkness. She remembered holding her daughter at the hospital, and that moment gave her the strength to let go. The razor dropped into the sink and her mother broke down. She wept at her weakness while her daughter died, alone and scared, miles away. I was lost in the recollection. The girl waited a few moments before repeating, "Why do bad things happen at all? Why do we need to suffer? You have to know. You made us to suffer." I paused. There were multiple ways I could answer her question, but there was only one true answer. She was on the brink of tears. A moment of light, a moment of clarity gave me the courage to give her the truth. I answered her. To give my life meaning. You all suffer to keep me going. To keep me interested. I sent her away before she could question my answer. In the end, I gave her the truth. I was God. I was a supreme being watching the world like a soap opera. I was a kid examining an ant mound with a magnifying glass, smiling as I incinerated those unlucky few. They suffered, so I could live through them vicariously. Their pain made me feel alive. The first time I thought I was going to die, I was 16 years old. I was slumped against the outside wall of what was supposed to be an abandoned warehouse, bleeding from a bullet wound and desperately wishing I hadn't dropped my gun. The only person who was supposed to be in the warehouse was some drug dealer that ripped Jeffrey off a few weeks ago. Jeffrey had approached me and said this was a perfect time to prove my loyalty and commitment. He gave me a vague description of a man, average height, dark hair, and something about always wearing a blue jacket. That simple description was all I had to go on. I had never actually seen him, and yet Jeff handed me a gun and gave me the address, instructions to kill him, and sent me on my merry way. I could still see his beaming face as I hesitantly accepted the firearm. And despite the fact that I grew up in a neighborhood rife with gun violence and my own personal involvement in organized criminal activity, I had never fired a gun. I carried a knife and cut a few people in a fight once, but there was something so much more serious about a gun. Something so final. With a blade, it took some precision and effort to fatally wound. With a gun, all you needed was a squeeze of the trigger. I swallowed my nervousness and accepted the order. And killing a man was simply the price to pay to earn the trust and move up in the world. I showed up at the warehouse and found that the drug dealer had friends. Armed friends. And the next thing I knew, I was leaning against the metal siding of a warehouse, wounded and defenseless. I dropped my gun at some point. I don't even remember what happened. I was dead. I closed my eyes. So, this was it? I should have been more upset than I was. I was going to die. I heard the men yelling not far off in the distance. I never had a chance. Where did the little shit go? The voice sounded as though it was coming from the other side of the wall. I don't know. You sure he's with Jeffrey? I ain't never seen him before. Yeah, I'd recognize that skinny little shit anywhere. There was a pause in the conversation, and I found myself holding my breath. Not as though that was actually going to do me any good. I think he went this way. I let my breath out. Yup, I was sure that was it. I looked down at the small river of blood flowing down my arm and pooling on the cement. I could get up and run. There was nothing seriously wrong with me, but I was winded and dizzy. Even if I managed to get up and run, there was nowhere to go. I didn't know the area as well as the men did.
I have to wonder, are you really ready to die?
I looked up at the sound of another voice. It was different from the others I had heard. The voice was male, but softer than the others. Yet there was a deep pitch to it that sent chills down my spine. I craned my neck around, trying to find the source, but I couldn't see anyone.
Do you realize everything that dying entails? There are an awful lot of details that are overlooked.
This time, the voice was followed by the sound of footsteps that came down from the alley.
Every cell in your body starts choking and dying. Neurons become confused, sending erratic last messages. Limbs begin to twitch. And of course there is the matter of bowels emptying. Well, are you as ready to die as you think you are?
One of the men was probably just messing with me, like a cat playing with its food. Why does it matter to you? I croaked. My voice was growing tired. I looked down the alleyway. The footsteps continued until I could make out a figure in the distance. The owner of the voice was a young man. He couldn't have been much older than me. He was dressed in a neat black suit with a dark red dress shirt. It was too dark in the alley to make out the details of his face, but his skin was so pale and he was almost glowing. He came close to me and I could better make out his face. His features were calm and even, and there was a slight smirk curling on his thin lips. If you're gonna kill me, just do it, I spat. He was messing with me. I knew he was.
Amazingly, I am here to do the exact opposite,
he said. He knelt down next to me and I shivered. It was as though he was radiating cold.
I am here to save you.
Who are you? It was the only thing I could think of to say. The men yelling from the other end of the alley drew my attention away from the strange man. The drug dealer and his armed friends had found me and were moving in for their kill. It didn't matter who killed me at that point. I just knew I was going to die.
But you're not,
the man said quietly. Not what? Did he just read my mind? I stared at him, and he nodded slightly before replying.
Going to die. Now just sit here while I take care of this. Then we can have a proper conversation,
he said, turning towards the armed men. I just stared at him. Maybe I was already dead or dying and this was some sort of hallucination. The armed men moved closer. They didn't seem the least bit concerned with the strange man. Who are you talking to? Or you praying or something? Can't say that's a bad idea in your position, a man barked, earning harsh laughter from the others. Did they not see him, the man in the suit? I looked to the stranger, and he only offered me a sardonic grin. Well, hey there, mate. We're going to send a message to Jeffrey and to the rest of them, thinking that they could just go and send some little twerp like you to take us. A different man spoke up. I recognized him as a man I had been sent to kill. I think his name was Jamie's something. Why was I thinking of that now? Why did it matter? The men started towards me, and in a moment of panic, I forced myself to my feet, but the blood loss had left me dizzy, and I ended up tumbling forward, smacking my face into the ground. I closed my eyes and listened to the footsteps. Any moment now, I'd be killed. A pathetic 16-year-old kid who got in over his head, dead from a bullet in the skull.
You're not dying. Stop being dramatic.
I heard the stranger's voice chide before 5 gunshots echoed in the alleyway. I squeezed my eyes shut and braced for the sting of bullets that never came. The only thing that followed was silence. Slowly, I lifted my head up. The stranger was leaning against the wall across from me, arms folded across his chest. He nodded over to where the men had been. They were all dead with 5 efficient bullets, 1 to each of their heads. I looked back to the stranger, who shrugged.
I told you this isn't your time to die. Here,
he said, and kicked a gun over to me.
It's easier to convince someone that you killed people if you are holding the murder weapon.
You killed them? I pulled myself back into a sitting position and stared at the gun.
Yes, it's what I do. Death is my business.
He was smiling. Nothing like the smirk he had been wearing before. He offered a hand to help me to my feet, which I accepted. I recoiled as soon as my hand touched his. He was ice cold. It was chilly out here tonight, sure, but this man's hand felt like nothing short of an ice sculpture. He noticed my reaction and reached out and grabbed my wrist and pulled me the rest of the way to my feet. Who are you?
Just an individual in the business of death,
he replied. You already said that. I mean, who are you? What are you doing here? The man didn't reply. He went down and picked up the gun and held it out to me.
You'll need this.
Without thinking, I reached out and grabbed the weapon from his hands. The thing felt awkward in my left hand, but my right hand was hanging limply at my side, useless aside from sending a steady wave of pain through my body. I awkwardly aimed the weapon at the stranger's head. I was going to get answers from him one way or another. Who are you? What do you want with me? I demanded. His only reply was to raise his eyebrows. Answer me, damn it!
I am just doing business, and I just wanted to offer you an opportunity to invest in my business.
I bared my teeth. None of these answers were helping ease my suspicions that this man was some sort of enforcer, here just to clean up the whole mess.
I'm not going to kill you,
the man said quietly. Then tell me who you are. Who are you with? I weakly waved the gun at him as I spoke. He sighed.
It is unlikely that you will believe me, but I am deaf.
Bullshit, I spat.
No, really, I am,
he said, and reached into his back pocket. As soon as his hand moved, I panicked. The trigger wasn't as heavy as I thought it would be. It moved easily under my finger. The resulting bang was nearly deafening. I watched the bullet fly towards the stranger. My shaky hand wasn't aiming anywhere in particular, but somehow, most likely because we were standing so close to each other, the bullet hit the stranger in the stomach. Or at least I thought it did. I saw the bullet race towards the man. I saw it disappear into his body. The man showed no reaction, not even a wince. There wasn't even a hole in his suit jacket. He barely paused in his motion of digging something out of his back pocket. I dropped the gun. What are you?
I told you. I am deaf. And yes, you did shoot me. But as you can imagine, I am rather immune to that sort of thing.
He had his wallet in his hand and pulled something out of it.
Now, this is for you.
He held out a simple black business card. Again, I was left with nothing to do but stare. My brain didn't know what to do with itself. So much had happened. Almost dying, being saved, a stranger claiming his death, shooting said stranger, and now the man was offering me a business card? If it wasn't for the constant pain in my shoulder, I would say this was a dream.
Take it. It's just a way to contact me in the future.
I reached out and nervously took the card. In neat curling letters, it spelled one word: death. And underneath was a normal-looking 7-digit phone number. Your death, I said, still unsure of the reality of the situation. And you have your own business card?
Yes, it's a matter of business. Managing products, shipments of goods, making sure the guys up top are kept happy. You know, it's all business.
Death explained with a shrug.
Anyway, this card is for you, and if you find yourself in need of assistance, feel free to give me a ring anytime. I can't guarantee I'll be there every time, but I will certainly try and be there when I am needed.
Death offered his hand again, asking for a handshake. Not knowing what else to do, I stuffed the business card in the front pocket of my hoodie before reaching out and accepting his hand. If he really was Death, that would certainly explain his ice-cold skin. Death left shortly after handing me the business card. He turned and walked down the alley but vanished after only a few steps. I remember that I managed to make it to a back road I knew and to a bus stop before I passed out. When I came to, I was in a hospital bed with Jeffrey standing over me, grinning like a madman. His normally neatly combed back hair was slightly messy and there was a beginning of a black eye on his face. I didn't know you had it in you. I gave him a confused look. What do you mean? He leaned down and whispered to me. Man, Daniel, you didn't just take out that Jamie bastard, you got Carl and Mark too. You single-handedly took out our biggest competitors. Good job. Oh, I said weakly. Those names meant very little to me. I wasn't involved too much in politics. I just followed Jeffrey around and helped him when I could. He was basically my brother. Man, Dalton and them have got to let you be official now, he said, ruffling my hair. I smiled weakly. I didn't care about being officially accepted into the inner circle, so to speak, but it seemed to make Jeff happy, so I figured I could play along. As soon as Jeffrey left and I was alone in my room, I reached over to the side table where my bloodied clothing was folded in a plastic bag and fished out my hoodie. Had I really met Death? Did I just black out and make up everything? The card was the only thing I could hold on to as proof, if in fact I still had the card. I didn't know if I was relieved or terrified when I pulled the black business card from the pocket. Jeff was right about one thing: the incident at the warehouse that sent me on the way to becoming official. The day after I left the hospital, well, more like escaped, as no one had any intentions of paying the bill, I decided that I was going to learn how to properly use a gun. Despite the fact that my first experience with one had been less than successful, I found that I actually had a talent for firearms. I used this talent to rise in the ranks until I was the unquestioned person to go for, as Jeffrey so delicately put it, to clean up. By the time I was 19, I had lost count of how many people I had killed. It probably should have bothered me more than it did, but Jeff was so encouraging, and it wasn't as though I had much of a talent for anything else, so I went with it. While I was rising, it seemed that Jeff was sinking, but it didn't dawn on me exactly how far Jeff had fallen until I received a simple text message one night. It was written in a code only a few people understood, but the message was clear. Apparently, Jeff had been caught stealing money, and the higher-ups decided that it was time to clean up the matter. I hadn't seen Jeff in weeks. I had moved out when I was 18 and was living rather well on my own, and people tended to pay good money to have their messes cleaned up. I stared at the message for about 30 minutes, unsure of what to do with myself. I'd been killing people for 3 years, but I had never felt this ache in the pit of my stomach before. This sort of hesitation and doubt. Everything I had done before was for Jeff's approval. He was as large a part of the reason I was doing so well. Well, he had practically raised me. How could I possibly turn around and do this? Still holding the cell phone, I sank down into my couch. How could I suddenly be unsure about killing when the very couch I was paid on was paid for with blood money? Without really thinking, I pulled my wallet from my back pocket. I had held on to the business card this whole time. It was currently tucked in the back of my wallet. I hadn't looked at it properly since I was in the hospital 3 years ago, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Despite the time that had passed, the card was still in perfect condition. Pure black cardstock with neat white letters spelled out death, and under that, any questions, please call. I looked at it confused. Had it changed? I hadn't looked at it a while, but I was sure the part about questions wasn't there before. I figured it was just a trick my mind was pulling and I forgot about it. I dialed the number, not knowing what I was to expect. No sooner had I entered the number and pressed the phone to my ear did I hear Death. Only his voice wasn't coming from the phone, but from right behind me.
"You rang,"
he said, sounding amused. I dropped the phone and turned to see Death standing behind the couch, not looking any different than he had the night at the warehouse. Yeah, I trailed off. Why had I called him? It seemed like a good idea. I was conflicted about something that could possibly result in death, so who was better to consult than Death himself?
"You want to know if you should follow the order, like the many you have followed before, and kill your friend,"
Death said, stealing words straight from my brain. He moved from behind the couch and made himself comfortable in a chair across from me. He sat down delicately, crossing his legs, propping his arm on the side of the chair and resting his head on his hand lazily. Yeah. It seemed I was only capable of one-syllable answers this evening.
This is a dilemma, isn't it? Kill the man who basically raised you to be what you are today, or risk losing your credibility in your chosen profession. Tough choice.
He paused, looking down at his fingernails as though inspecting them for dirt. Jeff, he took care of me when no one else did. Even when he was only 17 and selling dope to my mom, he would always ask how my schoolwork was coming and bringing me treats. I was 12 years old and excited at the aspect of counting a real live gangster as one of my friends. He always called me the brother he never had. I looked over at Death, who looked unimpressed by my emotional recall of my childhood.
"Daniel,"
he said, and I jumped at the sound of him using my name.
"let me share a secret of the world. People are fleeting. In the end, you are the only person left who will look out for you. Remember that."
But how can I just go and shoot him, just like that, and ignore everything he's done for me? I was becoming frustrated. Not because Death wasn't saying what I wanted him to, but because he was saying exactly what I needed to hear.
"Think of it this way,"
he said, leaning forward in his chair.
"Joffrey wanted you to succeed in life, correct?
I nodded.
Then he would not want you to turn down a job this important."
He finished, grinning. I don't know if I can do this, I muttered as I looked down at the discarded cell phone.
"Sure you can. I'll even go with you,"
Death said, standing up from his chair.
"If you think it would help you, remember that. In the end, you are not killing anyone. I am."
I nodded, and just like that, I made up my mind to kill the man who raised me. Death was true to his word. He followed me along the all-too-familiar path to Jeff's apartment building. It was freezing outside. I was bundled in a thick leather jacket and skin-tight leather gloves encased my hands. Under my jacket, I could feel the weight of the gun against my hip. It was like an icicle hanging from my belt. Despite the cold air, Death did not seem the least bit fazed, even though he was still dressed in the same simple suit I'd first seen him in. In no time at all, I was standing outside the door to Jeff's apartment, fighting back memories with Death standing idly behind me whistling. He had assured me that no one could hear him or see him except me, which was comforting and awkward at the same time. I knocked, and Jeff came to the door. He looked terrible. His blonde hair that was normally kept short and slicked back was a greasy mess hanging down over his face. His eyes had thick, dark circles under them, and there were a few fresh cuts to it. "Hey, Daniel, man. What brings you here?" His voice was weak and cracked, but he still seemed glad to see me. "Can I come in?" I said, smiling slightly. I glanced back at Death, who offered what I could only assume was an encouraging smile. "Yeah, sure. It's filthy in here, but when hasn't it been?" He laughed weakly and stepped aside, allowing me in. As soon as I was in, he closed and locked the door. I noticed the addition of several more locks. He knew people would be after him. Death materialized in the apartment and stood behind me.
"Do it quickly. Get it over with,"
he said. It was like the cartoons of devils and angels on people's shoulders who guide their actions. Except I was missing my angel. "I needed to talk to you," I said.
"No, you didn't,"
Death whispered. "Sure," Jeff said, motioning to the cluttered living room. There were piles of dishes and clothing everywhere, along with several half-packed suitcases and boxes. He moved over to a set of chairs and began shifting through the mess to clear off a place to sit. As his back was turned, I reached into my coat and wrapped my hands around the gun. There was a heavy silencer attached, making the gun heavier, but it was comfortable in my hand. Jeff's back was to me when I moved closer and took aim. Death was now standing next to me, just in my line of vision. My finger was positioned on the trigger, ready to pull it when Jeff turned around. His eyes went wide. There was a look of complete and utter despair on his face. I felt myself waver until Death reached out and placed an icy cold hand on my wrist. "Daniel," Jeff breathed. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. I wasn't sure if he even heard me, because at the same time, I squeezed the trigger. Despite what people think, silencers don't make a gun silent. They quiet them down, but guns are still loud weapons. I didn't have the time to stand around and contemplate what I had just done. Death was smiling as he followed me back to my apartment. I knew this was his job and everything, but I couldn't figure out what about this situation made him so happy. Regardless of how I felt after killing Jeff, it had an undeniable positive effect on my career. It made me look heartless and cold and ruthless, which apparently were traits that were highly valuable in my profession. I found out very quickly that word of mouth was the best business plan anyone could use, and though I kept myself available for my original employers, freelance work was easy to find and very lucrative. 2 years after Jeffrey had died, I had enough resources to make myself disappear. I kept taking jobs because it was the only thing I knew. I had been completely desensitized to death. On the matter of death, I still kept the card tucked in the back of my wallet no matter where I went. Interestingly, the card never showed any signs of wear and tear. 4 days before my 24th birthday, I took possibly the biggest job of my career. I avoid politics like the plague, but I could tell this job was important and therefore political, and simply based on the number of zeros attached to the payment. It was a sniper job, which I didn't particularly care for, but the amount I was being paid far outweighed any personal preference I had. The worst part about sniper jobs was the waiting. I was glad, at least, for the comfortable weather. Not too warm, but with just enough of a chill to the air to make it pleasant. Being that I was jammed in an awkward corner on an apartment building roof, I took comfort where I could find it. My gun was set up, aiming at the hotel down the street. The target was supposed to be there by 8 o'clock. It was already past 7:50. I had only the briefest chance for a shot. I saw the target's entourage turn the corner and I took my position behind the scope. I had no idea which car the target was in, but I aimed somewhere in the middle, hoping I had the time I needed to make the shot. The car doors opened and I took aim. I was ready. I had to wonder, though, who was this man that was worth so much money? I had heard his name around, but I wasn't exactly sure who he was. I blinked and focused back to the scope before squeezing the trigger. As soon as I did, I realized something had gone very wrong. I had been off focus. I missed the target completely. I must have hit someone because there was chaos in the street. I cursed aloud to myself. This was too large of a job to screw up. I refocused, trying to see if I could still get a shot in, and quickly realized there was no way to do it. I needed to move fast. I didn't have time to fix my mistake.
You know, daydreaming on a job is a rather bad habit.
I twisted around in my hiding place to see Death standing over me. I was tempted to yell at him to get down before I remembered that I was the only one that could see him. "I didn't call you. Why are you here?" I hissed, beginning to disassemble my gun.
You don't need a phone to call me,
he said, squatting down to be on my eye level.
Anyway, I can help you.
Why would you do that?
No reason,
he said with a smile that said just the opposite.
Stop that.
He motioned to me as I was detaching the scope.
Just take aim, and I will take care of the rest.
I was about to tell him there was nothing he could possibly do when he suddenly vanished. I screwed the scope back into place quickly and looked down at the scene. I couldn't make heads or tails of what was going on. I saw a group of dark-suited men in a huddle and assumed that was where the target was. Death had about 10 seconds to prove he could do something before I was gone. 4 seconds into my countdown, I watched Death calmly stroll over to the group of men. He lingered outside the huddle for a few seconds before the suits dispersed and I saw the target clearly. He was pushing his guards away from him and moving more into the open. I didn't want to miss my second chance, and pulled the trigger once more. In time with the gunshot, Death reappeared beside me.
You're welcome, kid.
How did you do that? Why did you do that?
I'm deaf. I can do a lot. And because I felt like it. Anyway, a heads up. Next time I see you, I will be asking a favor,
Death said. And for the first time since I met him, his face was void of any smile. It was 3 days after the nearly botched job on the roof that I found out who the man I shot was. Apparently, he was some newly elected president of a war-torn country, and was winning all sorts of human rights awards for ending the war and helping the people of his country. But his death had started yet another war. I had single-handedly started a war. Not only had I started it, I had killed a man who had done nothing but try and bring peace. The second time in my life I was convinced I was going to die, I was 26 years old. I had found myself back in my hometown, which was probably my first mistake. There were a number of bridges I had burned when I disappeared, but still, for some reason, I found myself walking the same streets I had once followed Jeff down. I got a room in an out-of-the-way motel. I had no idea what I was doing with my life. After the rooftop incident, and inadvertently starting a war, I pulled myself off the radar and took a vacation of sorts. 2 years later, I was back at home. Nothing seemed to have changed. The small diner Jeff and I would go to after his weekly drops was still there and still serving the same chili cheese fries he and I would split. I ordered a plate of them for dinner, but couldn't manage to eat the whole thing. I wandered around the city block for a few hours, taking in the subtle changes. The warehouses where I had almost died and first met death were no longer abandoned, and the apartment building Jeff had lived in was condemned. I should have cared more than I did. I just couldn't bring myself to really care about anything. I stared up at the apartment building and realized that I didn't regret killing Jeff. Somehow, I didn't regret anything. Having enough of nostalgia, I headed back to my hotel, cutting through alleyways and taking back streets. Even after all this time, I knew this city like the back of my hand. As I walked back, I found myself thinking about death. I was still puzzled about what he said about asking a favor of me, but 2 years later, I had yet to hear from him. I occasionally pulled the card from my wallet and looked at it, considered calling, but never actually following through. I was curious on how he knew I needed help that day on the roof. I had stopped thinking about the oddity of having Death's phone number a while ago. I just considered it my special gift, my talent, and the one thing that really set me apart from the rest of the world. I didn't question if he was real or not anymore. Occasionally, logic reared its ugly head, but the matter was too tiring to attempt to sort out. Death was a young, average man with dirty blonde hair and simple features who always wore a dark suit and a smile. That was it. I was caught up in my thoughts, and since my feet knew the way, I wasn't exactly paying attention to my surroundings. I did notice, however, when I felt the cool metal of a gun barrel pressed against my back. I had 3 different weapons on my person at the moment, and I could tell from where the gun was pressed that the would-be shooter was more likely just a kid. I held up my hands dramatically before turning around. "Kid, this is a bad idea." "Shut up," the kid snarled, and I couldn't help but be reminded of myself. He couldn't be more than 15 years old, and it was obvious that he was in way over his head and completely oblivious. It was easy to look at his short black hair and instead see my own brown hair matted and sweaty on my nervous brow. I see his short, pudgy stature and instead see my own awkward, lanky stance. It was so surreal, like looking through a one-way mirror into the past. "Well, is this a robbery? Is that what the guys are asking for nowadays to get in?" I asked, adding air quotes with my fingers. "No," the kid said sharply. "I know who you are. They told me if I killed you, they'd forgive my brother." I wasn't surprised. I figured Dalton would have some hurt feelings since I left for bigger and better things. "Oh, really? So what exactly did your brother do?" "None of your damn business, but I have to kill you." His hands were shaking as he pointed the gun at me. I took a step back. "Sorry, kid, but I have no intention of dying tonight, so I think we have a problem." I lowered my hands and the kid tensed. He wasn't going to shoot me. There was no way. I started to reach into my jacket slowly as the kid stood shaken, his gun still trained on my stomach. "Stop moving!" the kid yelled. I just shook my head. "Look, kid, we both know you aren't gonna..." I was interrupted mid-sentence by a sharp pain in my gut. I hadn't even registered the gunshot before I was doubled over, holding my stomach in shock as blood rushed from my body. I looked up at the kid. His eyes went wide, and terror etched on his face. He tossed the gun away before turning and running away, leaving me alone in a back alley bleeding. My brain was a jumble of pain, but somehow, I managed to convince my body to listen to me. I dug my wallet from my pocket and fumbled for Death's business card. The card was barely in my hand before I heard Death's distinctive voice from down the alley.
This is a familiar sight,
he said, his tone painfully cheerful. Please, help.
The last time something like this happened, you seemed so ready to expire. Why have things changed?
He asked. He was now standing over me, smirking. I don't want to die, I said. And I didn't. I never wanted to die. I was scared to die. Death was a natural thing for a human to be fearful of.
Not quite.
Death piped in, reminding me of his ability to read my mind.
Most humans, when face to face with death, are not fearful. 10 years ago, you were accepting, but now, after 10 years of bloodshed and body counts, you are fearful.
What? I wheezed, my body denying my attempt at speaking. Death knelt in front of me.
Daniel, you were a good kid 10 years ago. You were a stupid kid following around your hero in a desperate attempt for approval. You were normal.
Death paused for a moment, looking up at the night sky with a considerate look on his face.
You want to know a secret? You were supposed to die behind that warehouse 10 years ago.
I had figured as much. At this point, I was grateful Death had access to my thoughts because my body had all but given up. One hand was still pressed into the wound on my stomach, though it was doing nothing to stop the blood.
I set you on your path. I helped you along when you needed it and molded you into exactly what I wanted you to be.
What was that? I thought, and Death's face lit up.
To be me.
He stood up and shrugged off his suit jacket, and I saw at once that the shirt I'd always assumed was a dark red was actually white, and the red was a stain that blossomed out from Death's chest.
You see,
he said, undoing the top button of his shirt.
Death, this form of death anyway, starts as a human that must meet certain requirements, one of those being a body count. That part is easy enough to get, but it's the details that are difficult.
He pulled open the top of his shirt, and I saw a gaping wound in the center of his chest.
Betrayal,
Death said, counting on his fingers.
And killing of peace, and then the absence of guilt.
He paused.
Well, and of course, the body count, which by the way, yours is great. It far outnumbers mine, and I was killed in war.
You died? I questioned in my head, and Death smiled.
Over 400 years ago, just like you, I was groomed to fulfill every aspect of becoming Death.
I stared at Death, my vision becoming fuzzy. I felt my body shiver and shake. I was dying. This was it. My mind began to panic, but all the same sensation was like that of falling asleep. And the closer to sleep I got, the less aware of the pain I was. Just as I was drifting off into darkness, I felt a violent jerk that pulled me back to reality and pain.
The downside of being deaf,
he said, poking at his own wound.
This has been bleeding for centuries, and I still can't get used to it.
He looked to me.
Death isn't dead, by the way. You will live in that state you are now, forever, or until you can find someone to replace you.
I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was a dream. It had to be. I'd wake up and I would be in my hotel, or better yet, I'd wake up and be 16, sleeping on just a fold-away sofa.
Wishful thinking will get you nowhere. That is just friendly advice,
Death said. I looked up at him. Somehow my vision was restoring itself, but the pain in my gut was growing stronger. Death suddenly let out a terrifying laugh and fell to his knees. I watched as his body began to decay like a video on fast forward. In the span of a few seconds, I watched as his skin bloated and then shrank. His hair grew, becoming discolored and fell from his scalp. His bones became visible as skin slid off in chunks before turning to ash and disappearing. when the man I once knew as Death was nothing more than a skeleton, he turned to me.
I finally can rest. I finally can die. And for once, I am not afraid.
I watched as his bones fell into a pile of dust, and at the same moment, I felt all sense of dying disappear. I was no longer tired, and my body no longer felt as though it was shutting down. The bullet wound in my stomach still hurt like hell, but I wasn't dying. I slowly pulled myself to my feet and realized I still had the business card in my hand. It was now smeared with my blood, and instead of the neat letters spelling out death and a phone number, there were 4 words. Your turn. Have fun.